And so we return and begin again. Hello, I'm Bobsy. Welcome to the Invisible Podcast Issuesode 17, Part 2. It's been ages. Really sorry. You don't really care, but it's been ages. Lockdown's kind of finished. And so now, so what? This is like middle of August. I didn't get a podcast, an episode of this done in July, but I did do. The reason I didn't get it done is because I did a couple of episodes of my side project, Deep Status, with the boy Sean. If you go to patreon.com/deep status or deep_status, I think it is on Twitter. There's me applying a similar lens, my critical paranoiac, I flatter myself, method on like kind of general news in midsummer 2020, which was pretty effed up, I'm sure you'll agree, and also kind of goings on in Leicester in the UK. So that's why there wasn't an Invisible show in July. I realised that the last show only got us halfway through this issue, so we're still stuck on this. And we're going to rip through it. We're not. We are. We're going to rip through it. Like I say, we're mid-August now. The heat wave of August 2020 has just kind of broken. Now we're in the middle of like a wet wave with like you might be able to hear it outside, the rain. It was lovely actually. I got caught in the rain when I went to the shops earlier, and it was really nice. But lockdown is finished. We're in this kind of quasi not normality situation. The streets are busy, but not as busy. I mean, like heavy dystopian vibes. What can I say? I'm not averse to wearing my bandana. In fact, I look pretty good in it. And I've got this interesting, Passadist bandit from Vietnam look going on. It's strong. I look good. But the world's weird. The world feels a bit broken. It just does at the moment. And there. So I'm pretty sure when we last left we had got all the way as far as page 7. Oh my God, we've got so much further to go still. King was being interrogated by Sir Miles, right? And we're on this page now. This is page 7. What I would note about this page, so we're back in like these kind of like snapshotty Gideon Stargrave stories that are basically Jerry Cornelius stories that are being thrown by King Mob's psychic martial arts protection shields at Sir Miles every time he tries to do like a psychic mind read of him. Yeah, I don't know if we've established that. I can't really remember how far we got in with the last issue in terms of like what's actually going on in the narrative. But this page is great. It's really, really good. So there's like a kind of an alien hive blob has taken over the shattered ruins of Westminster Palace. Do I mean Westminster Palace? Oh yeah, the Palace of Westminster. And he's in like a kind of a slightly old school World War II bomber. He's dropping an Omega bomb. I think an Omega bomb probably comes from Philip K. Dick, but you know, an Omega bomb is like the bomb that ends things. He's dropping it from his plane onto this kind of gelatinous alien hive that's overtaken the heart of Great Britain in this kind of weird parallel reality. What we need to mention here is so one of the captions. Look, this is Gideon Stargrave. He looks like King Mob, obviously we know that, and he's piloting. And it's about Biggles, and he's wearing kind of a blank badge, but not quite. And Biggles is like one of the, kind of quasi-imperialist fictional characters of young fiction for boys that someone King Mob's age, or indeed Grant Morrison's age, may have read or had been expected to read in their youth. He's in the cockpit of this bomber. He's got a bomber jacket on. He's got a Biggles kind of leather flying cap on, shades because he wears shades. He's that kind of all the time. He's that kind of guy. And this cute little kitty cat in his kind of stuffed into his jacket. And the caption reads, Gideon Stargrave, the last man on Earth, never one for prayers, hums Babies in Black and activates the bomb release while Boots, the last cat on Earth, farts nervously sensing death. Time stops. So, Babies in Black is a Beatles song. Okay, now also Beatles, right? Insectoid, right? This is like the early kind of Beatles themey stuff that we've had from the very beginning of the show. The comic, is giving way to a bit more of like a layered up meaning of what that insectoid metaphor sort of means. And we'll actually get quite a lot of that in the next couple of issues, but also like as we go further. Obviously, there's a lot of insectoid imagery having happened in the Jim Crow voodoo issue, yeah? The one drawn by Chris Weston. Non-human forms of intelligence that are taking over and hegemonic in a kind of obviously like political sense is what is going on here, right? So like non-individualized intelligences that are icky, right? This is probably a pretty old trope in sci-fi, but really aliens. Yeah, you've got the alien is scary enough, but the aliens, when they multiply and are led by a kind of a single kind of evil woman archetype intelligence, are pretty scary, and definitely like a powerful type of what the threat in terms of like the existential shock against a human subjectivity is or would be. Yeah, that's like the thing that humans are scared of is a type of intelligence which resembles something which we can see in nature, which is an insectoid hive mind. And here, look, it's taken over London. How dare it? Okay, but he's listening to Babies in Black. Babies in Black is a Beatles song from '64, Beatles for Sale, that album. And it's got lovely close harmonies from John and Paul. But the baby who's in black of the in question is Astrid Kirchhoff. It's basically a song that Lennon wrote about Stuart Sutcliffe's funeral. Now, remember, I did say Stuart Sutcliffe and not Peter Sutcliffe, didn't I? Yeah, I got it right. It's okay. Remember issue 1? Stuart Sutcliffe, sorry, and John Lennon are having the chat on the dockside. Dane sees them because he can see through time. Yeah, like that. And Stuart Sutcliffe mentions wanting to get back to Hamburg and his painting and Astrid. Babies in Black is written about Astrid at Stuart's funeral. So that ties us back to our first issue. But kind of better and worse and more depressing than that, if we think back to May, which is technically, I think, still within the reach of when I started thinking and reading and talking about this issue, even though, as I say, I've skipped a month, so we're way off track by now. I do hope to catch up with myself a bit at some point, but also I want to do more of the Deep Status podcast. But anyway, sorry, within the reach of when I started reading this issue, which started in May, believe it or not, now, on about the 14th of May this year, Astrid Kirchhoff, the real life woman, and I'm going to go for it here, and I'm going to say that basically a very good translation of the name Astrid Kirchhoff is Star Temple in English. Astrid Kirchhoff died in real life, just as Gideon Stargrave and Boots, the last cat on Earth, sensed death and listened to a song that was written about her, a very famous song that was written about her, kind of coming close to death in life. It's all about her mourning at the funeral, wearing black. And then she died for real while this panel was happening here in 2020. And that's sad because she was kind of, a very, very, very cool person. And she maybe wasn't terribly famous among normies, but the kind of like the boomageddon that we're in at the moment. Sorry for calling them boomers. It does feel a bit reductive, but you know what I mean. She kind of lived out the desire or the joy that they all kind of aspired to. Like whether they knew it or not, every woman who's basically like my mum's age wanted to be as cool as Astrid Kircher. That was as cool as you could be. She was the coolest woman on earth. Basically, like a really good photographer, really like sort of with it person, artistic, smart. All of the Beatles were in love with her, right? Um, and she was so cool, she rejected them in order for like the good-looking one who wasn't in the Beatles. Uh, just like a ridiculously bangingly cool chick, really. Uh, and she died while this happened, so that's weird. So that's a kind of a moment of, you know, of passing, right? Things are like the new world is obviously struggling to be born, but the old world isn't having that much trouble dying. As Astrid Kircher, she of the Star Temple, would say. And then you get these, as this kind of Omega bomb is being dropped, we rip back into the interrogation room. There's another look of terror on King Mob's face. Some Miles getting up in him, and he's like, and King Mob is still playing the denial card. I'm not. Just don't listen to me. I'm not. My name's Kirk Morrison. I'm a writer. My name's Kirk Morrison. So Kirk again, uh, church, right? Especially like Scottish church. Kirk Morrison. So he's obviously we're getting meta here, and frankly, I find that not my favourite. It's a bit annoying, isn't it? Meta stuff. It's not my favourite aspect of Morrison's writing. Uh, but it does. But well, I don't think I'm going to talk about it for another issue or two. But this is the point. I think I mentioned this before. This is the point where Morrison begins to write himself into the comic quite actively, and where it starts to have interesting real world effects for him. We've established, I think, by now that the Invisibles itself has interesting real world effects. It's still very lively, still got lots of tentacles out there in 5D space, and has some pretty wicked magic in it, basically. And this is the point where Grant Morrison, the author of the piece, tries to quite deliberately sort of put this magic into himself, right? With various effects. Uh, But he's like, no, I'm just a guy. I'm called Kirk Morrison. I'm an author. I wrote a successful book called The Killing Moon. It's just a book. Listen to me. Please don't hurt me. Da-da-da. You're King. And Miles gets enraged and whacks him in the face with the torture manual. You're King Mob, damn you! Ah, God damn you! And he sort of slaps him again. It looks like. Oh no, he throws the book away. This book, which we've established, is basically like a pervy joke. We mentioned that in the Crucia. And he says, and Morrison, Kirk Morrison, King Mob, as we know him, says there's some kind of his speech is all kind of like written shakily, and he's all very weak. But he says there's some kind of anarchist group from the 60s, aren't they? King Mob. Look, I don't know what you want me to say. Please. So King Mob was this kind of like anarcho-situationist collective from from the late 60s, operating kind of in the West London, Ladbroke Grove, Notting Hillish kind of area that would later be colonised by the ascendant Tories of the 20s, and 10s, and but which was also like the home of Hawkwind, Michael Moorcock, same thing, and Jerry Cornelius in the Jerry Cornelius novels, right? So part of the vibe that was kind of was kind of in the air around the Jerry Cornelius thing that this comic is all riffing off was King Mob, right? This is a book that I've been reading for homework, published in 2014, written by Dave Wise with Stuart Wise and Nick Brandt, and it's basically the guys, like the main guys in King Mob were David and Stuart Wise, and they were this kind of like anarcho art situationist collective in the late 60s and early 70s, very much part of that psychedelic hippie scene, but with a political edge. Who did, they were kind of pranksters, and like urban pranksters who were quite concerned with the ability to use situationist techniques such as De Boer. We discussed all of this back in like issues 2 and 3, if you remember, like kind of using pranks or kind of destabilizing situations to open up the city from the death grip of capital. Yeah, let's go for it. And create a space that could be shared more equitably by people. So they used to do all sorts of things, like basically like tearing down railings and gates and stuff in private parks and letting people, and then next thing you know, like just the whole community is using it rather than it being like a fenced off space for rich people. This is a tendency which, as I said, was incredibly accelerated after that point. The diagnosis of the situationists and of Wise and the King Mobites was biggity bang on. One of the more, especially as the way that it related to usage of urban space and freedom within urban spaces for the non-capitalist class, is basically the maybe one of the biggest effects that we're going to see out of the age of Corona is going to be a bit of a rethink of the way urban space is used. Basically, you don't need urban spaces to work in anymore, and that changes things dramatically, right? Corona proved that you could kind of the bits of the economy which were still sort of producing value could be done, because it's all immaterial labor, could be done from home, right? So you don't need a workspace anymore. So that traditional function of densely populated urban areas isn't in play. On the one hand, maybe that means like degentrification, which would be great for all kinds of reasons. It would be cool if cities became cool again. But the kind of the tendency that the King Mob group was raiding against maybe won't be in effect anymore. And I would go so far as to say as that is, it's very archonic to remove the spatial power of the human body from political contestation, right? So basically, the reason that King Mob is a thing, and I talked about how King Mob's rule and writ ran and do run last time. That's only possible because you have lots of bodies of laborers in a space, basically, and they're highly concentrated. Messages can travel, information can travel between humans very quickly, clandestinely, and then you can literally put those bodies in spaces to stop political power from being able to be exercised by abstracted or hierarchical powers, right? So basically what that means is you can have a demo, you can have a protest, you can block the roads, you can picket the office or the workplace or the government department, you can put things in the way, human bodies, which stop other human bodies from being able to get through and stop society from being able to function, forcing concessions. Right, that's how politics works. That's what the power of King Mob really comes down to. Now, if you have a situation where the urban space doesn't need to be densely populated, because you don't need lots and lots of people to be able to go to work in an office or a factory, or it's offices these days, and all of that is happening back in the home, and that home can be in suburban or rural even, or kind of non-urban spaces. That power of people to collectively gather and exercise power is dramatically curtailed. That's the ultimate downside of deurbanization and of the flexibility of working from home, right? Don't lose, the city kind of happened as a result of the large scale British and then global cities that we see happened as a result of industrial economies. Obviously, they had cities before they had industries, but the levels of them, the sizes of them, and the levels of concentration in them are primarily an effect of industrial working spaces and practices. And that's also like the kind of the main power wedge that non-property owning classes, non-capital owning classes have had. So King Mob's power could be dramatically curtailed by people no longer needing to work in the city. So think about that. Think about why that might be worth resisting. Sit with that for a bit. The King Mob book is kind of interesting. It's very of its time, and like I say, it was published in 2014, written about the 60s and 70s. It's very of its time, and it's very of its type. Like David Wise, the Wises, they are, they're 60s, 70s leftists, right, with an art bent, with an art school bent, and they 1,000,000% sound like it. This is the rhetoric in this is very old-fashioned seeming, very strong. Like the analysis is pretty spot on, but the rhetoric is incredibly sort of strident and uses quite like a high-handed moral tone, which is pretty unpleasant, really. It's basically like the stereotype of like kind of like annoying, sort of annoying British leftism, like Rick Mail from the Young Ones, is really strong in this. And there's this real tension between them wanting to be taken seriously as like art school provocateurs, and also with this built-in massive resentment they never got, their own show at the Royal Society that they don't want anyway. Like there's a real tension there between their disavowal of the art world and a quite kind of an obvious desire that they would like to get invited, that they would like to be invited to the party sometimes. Maybe I'm being a bit harsh on them there, but there's a real like there's a really, like, I think strident is the word, and you know how kind of grating that can be. There's a really strident tone to this, which is quite kind of off-putting and kind of difficult to read. He does start. No, he's a fairly weird bloke, I think, and that's fine. Like, I like weird blokes. The first line, more or less, I met a prostitute, Angela W., from the fishing port of Grimsby on the mouth of the Humber in the north of England. I instantly fell in love with her in an all-consuming way. The whole first chapter of this, where he keeps talking about how kind of old this sex worker that it's really like, shit, why are you fixating on that? This sex worker that he fell in love with was, it's basically like an invocation of Babylon. I don't think he would put it in those terms at all, but whenever you start a book off with like a weirdly sort of desire-led oppositional surrender, if that's possible, if you can have an oppositional surrender to a sex worker who you're obsessed with, that's an invocation of Babylon, and it's literally what this book, his own kind of memoir of what the King Mob years and actions were like. He literally starts his book with it. He dedicates the book. Well, I don't think he knows he's doing it, but he dedicates his book to Babylon with this kind of like slightly like TMI kind of like description of his relationship with this woman, while also going, God, she was old and saggy. And it's like, okay, cool, man, but does she want you to talk about her like that? Yeah. And this book's quite difficult to read, quite annoying for all of that, for all of the fact that he's basically not wrong about anything. Yeah. Although, like I say, there's this weird kind of like, we hate the Academy and we hate the Royal Academy. Did I say the Royal Society before? I think I did. But I mean the Art Academy, right? In off Piccadilly. That's the bit that he's kind of like, they keep going, we're not just involved in all this, we don't give a fuck about all this bourgeois art, but they really do. King Mob, this group that King Mob is kind of using as like, I'm not King Mob. King Mob is like a 60s anarcho group that he's using to sort of as a delaying tactic, as a spoiler, as a confusing tactic, as a bit of misdirection to use against Sir Miles. The reason that they're famous in like pop discourse, the kind of pop discourse that this comic and this issue as it goes on is very, very, very concerned with, is because so basically Malcolm McLaren the manager and provocateur kind of responsible for making the Sex Pistols, the punk band, into like a thing in '77, was in the late '60s and early '70s affiliated uh, with King Mob and David Wise and company. Now, Wise is very careful not to mention Malcolm McLaren once in this book, as far as I can see. And although the back does, the back blurb, which doesn't sound like David Wise had much to do with, said, obviously this is, I'm pretty sure this is like this is a copyright free work if not produced for profit. This is not a copyrighted piece of work by any means. David Wise would not have had much say in what is written on the back here. The psycho-mythological, and it says, the psycho-mythological legacy left behind by King Mob, nowadays often tied up with its assumed influence on Malcolm McLaren, the Pistols and punk rock, and via its wider situationist context, Factory Records and the Hacienda, bringing us into the rave culture era, far outweighs the physical imprint they left behind in the form of 6 glued-together copies of its often wildly and deliberately provocative publication and the iconic graffiti that can still be seen around parts of West London and beyond. It's hard not to like these guys, as annoying as their rhetoric can be. So McLaren kind of took the lessons of provocation from King Mob, pop spectacled it, and sold it. So Malcolm McLaren is like a posh kid like Malcolm McLaren. You can imagine Dave Wise not being that, absolutely loathing him. And I think in a lot of ways McLaren was a truly loathsome individual, but maybe kind of cool as well. Where was I going with that? Right, so that's why King Mob kind of became famous, because they were kind of picked up by the music press as being this kind of obvious and important influence on the Sex Pistols, who were kind of like the most important British band since the Beatles, who we talk about a lot on this show. And that's like maybe what am I talking? So what's the point there? Okay, so there's basically like there's like rebellion with fun and stuff. That's like the lesson of the Sex Pistols, right? Is that you can be independent and yourself and entirely kind of expressive and free from the man telling you what to do, and it's fun. Yeah, that's the kind of spirit that and the Pistols were kind of almost too aggressive to kind of for that to have got through. They didn't look like they were having fun. Like Lydon was too mardy, basically. But the kind of the iconic, sorry to use the word iconic, action of the King Mob group, which McLaren claims to be involved with, was like when they stormed Hamleys, like a very sort of posh and large central London toy shop, dressed up as Father Christmas around Christmas time. Just kind of like went in the shop, took loads of toys off the shelves, walked out the shop, and just gave them to loads of kids. Right? This is the myth. I'm not sure how true it is. It is true insofar as it did happen. I'm not sure how big or widespread or annoying it was. I imagine that the people at Hamleys kind of thought this is actually pretty good for our brand, although they wouldn't have put it in those terms. The spectacle does recoup things like that effortlessly. It's in situationist theory. But that's kind of the vibe that you get from the Invisibles, right? Is that everybody gets the utopia they deserve. It ties us back to Morrison and Dane McGowan's Kropotkin vibe. Kropotkin basically looked like Father Christmas, and the even more than Marx did. And there's this kind of there's this important thing which is kind of elided in the slightly sort of bitter tone that this book has, that like the revolution should be fun and that you should have nice things in it. Now that obviously causes paradoxes quickly, because it's like, okay, how are these nice things being produced? And if it's that they're being produced through the exploitation circuitry of capitalism, then there's a problem still, right? And that's a bit like and the King Mob project is kind of like, fuck that, put the desire first and the rest of it will and the means will flow, kind of thing. And there's something very appealing about the kind of magical thinking that implies, right? That like if you just give kids presents, the circuitry of exploitation lying behind the production of that present uh, loses its like malefic or archonic, to use a word, charge. Yeah, uh, it's appealing. It may not be terribly effective or convincing, but it's very appealing. And there's, like I said, there's something magical about it, right? There's something that like they were onto something, and certainly the Invisibles thinks they are onto something. It's just the character in my. He nearly says comic, but no, I think he means book. Uh, I'm not political. This is a mistake. Interesting, right? That's interesting because remember where we are. We're in Fukuyama territory, and uh, even like King Mob is kind of not lying by saying I'm not political. Uh, Political then would have meant or being like political enough to get nicked by the cops then would have basically meant you were like IRA adjacent, basically. We've had some rumblings from them in previous issues, obviously. But it's kind of not a lie that King Mob is saying that he's not political at this point, because think about the kind of like social edifice that's constructing this comic. Uh, Even anarchist rebellion isn't political anymore, right? It's kind of become this spectacular fun. Boom, the nuclear bomb goes off, the Amiga bomb goes off, right? Uh, Fran is my girlfriend, he says, my boyfriend. I mean, the gender thing around Vanny hasn't been clearly worked out. Morrison sort of doesn't know what the fuck he's on about. But I think as we've covered, the for the time, we're quite ahead of the time. King Mob does refer to her as a transvestite, which I don't think is quite right. And then this Ace, sort of, Twin Peaks episode 8, highly kind of powdery, detailedy rendering of the Amiga bomb going off as carried on from the frame page. Okay, sorry, I spoiled this page a minute ago. This is an advert. Jeez Louise. For I've done 2 pages in half an hour. This is an advert for a computer game on the PlayStation 1 called Loaded. Loaded is obviously like a kind of a was kind of like a key word for this era, meaning sort of, cheap money, good drugs, hedonism. I'd never really, in England, we don't really have the connotation of like a loaded gun, but it's there. And this is like a kind of a grisly shoot 'em up that's kind of making a big virtue of its bloodiness, of its computer generated blood. This guy is kind of like, it's kind of obviously kind of tongue in cheek and funny because this guy looks like a very sort of scary, insane clown posse style Joker. He's got loads of guns, but he's also got a teddy bear because he's got a softer side and it's all a bit of fun. And really, I don't know what to say about this page or how it relates to the issue, except it has this kind of like quite innocent seeming early wave video gaming joy of uh violence, which is kind of nice. Before it became like, before all the violence was sort of too obviously just trying to get you to sign up to the military. More, more pleasurable form of digital violence. But none of that matters. None of that matters at all. The funny thing, the important thing, the only thing that you really need to say about this advert is that there's like a kind of a speech balloon sound effect on it, and it says fWank. And I don't know what the F is doing there, but basically it's funny because the word wank is on the is on the page, quite like really big. It's the first word you read, and I think it's just like a sound effect from the comic. From the video game. But it says fwank. Fwank isn't a word, but maybe he's called fwank. Is that right? Like as in Frank. I don't know, but basically, there's quite a lot of swearing in this book anyway, but you don't get swearing in adverts very much. But that one clearly says wank on it, and that's funny. Okay, over the page, Elric. So like, okay, let's read this. This is our White Wolf Publishing thing. I think we had this episode. I think we had this advert in our previous issue actually. But let's read the blurb on, or some of the blurb on this here advert for Elric, Song of the Black Sword, by like a reissue by the White Wolf Publishing guys, who we know well, of Michael Moorcock's 70s novel. Enter the world of Melnibone and the Young Kingdoms, poles in a cataclysmic encounter between the forces of chaos and law. It's about the Invisibles. The eternal champion is doomed to live forever in 1,000 incarnations. It's about the Invisibles. This is literally what King Mob and Gideon Stargrave are, right? Elric of Melnibone, emperor of the most powerful nation in the world, struggles for love, his empire, and his sanity. Little does he know he must also battle the forces of cosmic balance. So, like Jerry Cornelius, who Gideon Stargrave is ripped off, is one of the aspects of the Eternal Champion in a different context, right? So this Elric thing is basically just like giving you a little window into the meat behind this comic. And it's quite interesting to think that, like, I don't really know if that much really sort of happened of it. It's really interesting to think that Michael Moorcock was actually in the 90s, some 20 years after he or 30 years after he sort of made his reputation with like New Worlds and stuff, was maybe really influential and big at the time. He was obviously very influential on this comic, and this advert does let us read a bit. I mean, this is a cool, like the cover, you can't see much of it, and they've just taken quite an annoying sort of crop of it here. But like Elric, if you take off his white hair, he does look a lot like King Mob. It's a cool picture by Kent Williams, very sort of like painterly and serious, but it looks good. Yeah, that's why this. So that's why this is that advert is in the comic. Over on the next page, we're back in the room, and we're in Cairo, September 1994. So if you remember back, this is basically the shot of the pyramid in silhouette here. That's basically the first page of issue 1, right? Where he says, and so we return and begin again. And this guy here, El Fayed, he's the voice that we first hear in The Invisibles. This is, he was, remember he was kind of talking to King Mob then? This is kind of the same visit that King Mob and the same conversation that he and King Mob were having in Cairo, in Egypt at that time. The El Fayed thing, I'd mentioned it at the time. That's a reference to Princess Di's nearly father-in-law, right? It is. And it's a bit of a wheeze on Morrison's part, but I think it's fairly, in retrospect, I think it's fairly a profound wheeze too. And they have this quite fascinating chat here about, it's kind of just about acceleration, and it goes on to the next page as well, I think, or in a couple of pages time we get to it. So we're at the pyramids, all of the Illuminist iconography and understandings that you can bring to the table from that, and understandings about empire and spirits and Western understandings of spirits, right? That's all here. And then they're having this quite interesting conversation. And honestly, they describe accelerationism. Now, accelerationism didn't really become a talking point until kind of the late, for another, this is what, 1995, isn't it? Sorry, 1996. I should know that. So for at least another 10 years, this wouldn't become a topic of conversation. More like 15, maybe not 15, but 10 plus years. They're talking about accelerationism. Check this out. Ask yourself this question: why is it that, and this is Al Fayed talking, ask yourself this question: why is it that our species seems so dedicated to the complete destruction of its environment? Why do our actions appear to run counter to our survival? How do we explain humanity's restless consumption of all that lies in its path? How do we account for the hunger that is ravaging the earth? I don't know, Al Fayed. What's the punchline? King Mob sounds a bit like David Essex. Have you ever watched a caterpillar on a leaf, my friend? Have you seen the way it devours everything in its path? Things repeat themselves on all scales, from the smallest to the largest. As above, so below. So then he points at this kind of lovely, again, Phil Jimenez is killing it, and it's annoying that the adverts have kind of got in the way, because in terms of like the compositions of the page, the way that beautiful shot of the campfire and the Milky Way and the nuclear bomb would kind of be sitting next to each other. Otherwise, would have been spectacular. Things repeat themselves on all scales, from the smallest to the largest. So somewhere we're the galaxy that we exist in, all of these stars, and remember we're in this star temple here, and we heard about the star temple woman a couple of pages back, Astrid Kircher, is a caterpillar on a leaf. I'm not quite sure, or at least I won't say just yet, what's the caterpillar and what's the leaf, but there. I don't think Morrison kind of gets to the point with this until quite a lot later on in like book 3 of the Invisibles, basically, when he starts talking about like Kardashev scales and like alien intelligences. Basically, like if you had infinite power, you would create a technology which looked a bit like galaxies to do stuff with, right? So it's kind of like, it's like a sci-fi reinvention of like a deist god, yeah. The alien is the universe, right? Oh, okay. This is nice. We're back in the. We see Fanny, and she's okay. So she's obviously being held like next door. King Miles, Sir Miles did just say that. We're being held next door. She's okay, and Sir Miles is obviously kind of given up interrogating King Mob for a bit. So he's gone next door to try and interrogate Fanny. He uses like the classic. He's told us everything, so you might as well kind of tactic, which is kind of, whenever anybody does that, you're a bit like, well, if you really thought that, you wouldn't be bothering to continue asking anything, isn't it? And like, it's like a lot of like copyist interrogation techniques. I'm sure in the moment they work, but like logically they're a bit like, if I don't play the game, then they don't work. Um, I want to speak to she, and she's taking like her and King Mob obviously, and the whole cell presumably have all got a same game plan and which they're sticking to, because they're not just a gang of schlubs. They are like they are like brothers and sisters in the Invisible College or whatever, or in the Invisibles. They're both just, their obvious strategy for when they get pinched is just deny everything. Just deny everything and wait for an opportunity to arise. So she's like, what the fuck are you talking about? Why have I been arrested? I did stab that guy in my apartment, meaning Brody, but he had a fucking gun and he was, he was going to kill me. That's obviously self-defense. Like, what the fuck is this? Why are you arresting me? Then she kind of like pops up and goes, "Oh, please just let me out," because and that's a smart thing to do, and the payoff of that will happen later. And then she does one of her kind of like cheeky jokes. She really pushes King Miles's button, and he pushes him or her away. And she cracks another joke, and she's got such a cool tongue, and Sir Miles is such a dick. Even the guard is being won over by her and her witty rebellion against him. But Sir Miles is really pissed off, and it's good that Fanny can get under his skin so easily. Ice hockey advert. Do you remember this? EA Sports. Is it ice hockey? Oh, it's ice hockey and American football. Another PlayStation advert. Like the PlayStation had obviously just been launched, and they're really pushing it. Do I really have to talk about this advert? I really don't want to. There's nothing to say. You know that dream you've always had of playing professional sports? Well, it's not a dream anymore. It's a nightmare. I think that maybe fits with the issue, insofar as this could be kind of summing up King Mob's predicament currently, is that he's always wanted to be like a sexy James Bond anarcho killer spy, and he is, and that's cool, but he's getting the back end of it now, right? He's like the other thing that happens to people who are, cool, sexy James Bonds, is they get strapped to chairs and tortured. So he's living the dream, but he's seeing the nightmare side of it right now. Okay, and so King Mob goes in. Sir Miles goes into yet another room. Note the interesting mudra moves that this woman is maybe making while he's not in the room. Goes back in the room and says, "Yeah, I'm pretty sure it's King Mob, but but blah, you know." So this is Miss Dwyer. We met her briefly in issue 1. You remember, with her kind of like black linen shades. She said that she was Dame McGowan's like social worker, basically caseworker or something. So Miles like spells out where we are. She says, "Is he King Mob?" And he's like, and he offers this tattoo on the base of a scorpion on the base of his spine as evidence that he is King Mob. And to be fair, that's strong evidence. Like, so Miles knows he's King Mob. He just can't prove that he knows or get him to admit that he knows. Or sorry, he can't get him to admit it that he is King Mob. But like King, so Miles does know that it's him. But because of the way these kind of baddies work, you do need to get them to confess, basically. But is he King Mob? She's she's very sort of black and white about it. She needs more. She doesn't think that like just a tattoo should be evidence, which is kind of fair enough. They're talking, and then we start to see why she's doing these funny hand movements. Uh, what are you doing? And this is King Mars. What are you doing? What's that noise? And she says this. She's doing these kind of like yoga hand moves, right? One of the archons walks nearby, and there's a real like thing here, right? Is that we kind of thought that Sir Miles was kind of the leader of the baddies, or at least high up in the baddies. Turns out that he is, and we find this very like, whoa, uh, that actually Miss Dwyer is his boss. And Sir Miles isn't the kind of guy who, prior to now, has given the impression of having a boss. But he has. So um, immediately there's a different, like our understanding of him shift dramatically, right? Because the fact that he's got a boss actually uh, makes him a bit like you and me, right? Makes him a bit relatable, that he is subject to authority too. Uh, that's a really big shift in the way that his character should be perceived. And then it's like, and also it's like, okay, so this woman, she's really badass. So we know that he's got all sorts of psychic powers and doesn't blink about killing people on horseback and stuff. And she is scarier than he is. And it's like, oh, okay. He's doing this funky yoga stuff, and one of the archons walks nearby. He's coming from the direction that can't be pointed to. He's ready to intersect. Oh, for God's sake, you're not bringing one of them through. I wasn't told about this. I'm not prepared for the interface. Yeah, God. King Miles. King Miles? I might just start calling him King Miles. I think it's all right. Uh, he's bleeding again. This happens to him like all the time, doesn't it? He's bleeding from the mouth and the nose and the eyes. And it's like, and the blood's like pouring. It's horrible. It's like something from League of Gentlemen when they eat their weird meat, right? He doesn't come to us, we go to him. But that's because she's basically called through the big boss. And and this is one of those things where we go from kind of ground level urban fantasy, which is roughly what the Invisibles is, to like balls to the wall comic book monster time. And she has kind of done some flim flam and brought through her boss, the king of all tears, who is an archon. What? Suddenly, boom, within these 2 pages, on the kind of on a human level, we've learnt a lot about Sir Miles. And then on the kind of the cosmic, what the hell is going on in the Invisibles, which 16 odd, 17? 17 issues in, we still don't really know. Still don't really know what the kind of the Invisibles is about, like who the baddies are, why the goodies are fighting them. We don't really know that. Beyond like, oh, well, they like freedom and they like order. We have sort of met this guy before, I think. Pretty sure this is the guy that Mr. Gelt is worshipping in issue 1. It's such a good picture. It's such a good picture. Uh, Jimenez really goes to town on the hands, giving them lots of tentacly insectoid detail, and then leaves the face really sort of uh, indistinct, but still using like a clear line, still using like precision in his art style. But he just doesn't, he kind of you get the face of the monster, the King of All Tears, looks like sort of black liquid mirror Rorschach blot symmetry stuff. Uh, Rather than any, and it looks kind of like a face, sort of, but only insofar as it's got kind of like faciness to it. It's not actually got a face. This thing, like before, we saw that it didn't. Its face is very indistinct, and then we see this kind of like what's the word for, sort of like exterior spine, and these kind of like nasty uh horns growing out of its shoulders, but its horns, but the detailing on them is really quite precise and horrible. So they're sort of like antlers rather than horns, I guess. They're made of concentric rings. I think that's the difference between horns and antlers, isn't it? And we can see traces of Nemesis the Warlock in here. We can see traces of Doomsday, who is like a Superman baddie who very recently to now killed Superman in the Superman comic. So this is like comic books style or kind of tropes intruding into our sophisticated adult fantasy comic, The Invisibles, and it's brilliant. Like the kind of the shift in tone and the way that the comic is kind of bold enough to go, oh yeah, we're dealing with this, and it's a big fucking scary monster uh, that's scary in a way which is quite uniquely rendered for the time, and still actually, uh, that's that's cool. That's really good. We've like if enough wasn't already going on in this issue, they've thrown in that, and that's badass. That's great. Okay, cut to we're back in. There's another double page spread of Fanny and Boy hanging out. How are those guys getting on? More importantly, how does Phil Jimenez draw them? He makes them lush. Like Boy looks fit and her hair is awesome, and same with Robin. You know, he makes nice things look nice, and that's kind of why he's here. This is very like eye candy. It's very lookable at, very appealing. Uh, uh, they're in like the kind of the Shoreditch loft space that uh, Boy was in when she was teaching Jack yoga and kung fu, right? This appears to be their base in London. Uh, Robin is reading Time Out, which you used to have to read a lot to find which nightclubs to go to in London. That's relatable. Uh, I don't know why Time Out is covering this story of that she kind of um, is relating. She's telling Boy the cool thing that she's reading in her copy of Time Out. Oh no, she's not actually. Sorry, I got that wrong. She's I got that wrong. She's just kind of like they're just sort of chatting, and she's relating an anecdote that she's heard. Uh, Robin says this. I remember talking to this guy who'd been told he had throat cancer, but instead of panicking, he decided to treat the cancer cells as familiars, like his animal allies. Totem cancer cells. It's brilliant. The cancer talks to him. It stopped growing now and bonded to his vocal cords. There's some kind of new structure there. It takes control of his voice sometimes and describes other worlds or predicts the future. He's even got a name for it, Casper the benign tumor. Uh, this is like 90s humor. Steve Jobs took it quite seriously, apparently. But yeah, this is I don't know. It's just like a kind of a weirdo like anecdote to sort of fill some space and to kind of give them, and it's like Tarantino-esque dialogue, right? That you kind of this understanding of the way that characters in Pulp Fiction and Pulp Fiction talk that allows you to believe that they were having a conversation before you came in the room, and also kind of says, look, they just kind of talk shit with each other about random stuff like you do with the people you know. You just talk about, oh, I heard this thing once. It was da, da, da. Yeah, cancer that doesn't kill you but becomes your friend. Uh, Kind of massively offensive, but that's 90s humor for you too, right? This is the kind of thing you're allowed to be glib about as well. You're allowed to be glib about the Battle of the Sexes. Sorry to bring that one up. You're allowed to be glib about class. You're allowed to be glib about, the end of history. You're allowed to be glib about cancer, because even that was just a problem. If you just chilled out and started to go to a rave with your cancer, you wouldn't die from it. Like I say, some people took that more seriously than I think you should. So they're kind of just like killing time. Boy is doing kung fu practice, kicking this like shop dummy apart. And then the dialogue rhythm really works nicely though, because Robin is kind of like relating this kind of like funny story, and then she sort of snaps out of it and goes, "Look," she says, "Fanny and King Mob are really, really late now," and it's like, "We're worried, aren't we?" And it's like, "Oh yeah, good, they're worried. Their friends are worried." Um, Boy refers to the death card that they pulled when they were in the Smart Drinks bar the other day. Remember that? So that was months ago in terms of comic book time and in terms of podcasts about comic book time. But happened to them only yesterday. They've got Boy says she's got a bad feeling. Robin shares the bad feeling, and they're like, "Okay, so our friends are missing. We know that something. We both feel that something fucked up is happening. What are we going to do?" And Robin's plan is this: you go to King Mob's place, I go see a band. And that's why she's reading Time Out. She's not reading Time Out for funny stories about cancer. But Time Out is like a listings magazine, which at the time, I mean, it's probably still online. I'm too old to kind of care what's on at the clubs in London, and I don't live in London. But at the time, I did, or nearly did. I would do within a few months of this comic coming out. And yeah, you use Time Out to see where you were going that night. Like every flat you went to, would have a copy of that, because there was a lot of nightclubs that you wanted to go to, a lot of parties to go to, and you did a lot of cool, loads of cool shit going on in London that you wanted to see. There still is. London isn't quite as dead as it is often described as being, but it could be less dead, couldn't it? London, couldn't you, London? And again, maybe Corona will undead it a bit, ironically, but that will come with its own unintended and perhaps unwanted consequences. See what I was just talking about. Okay, so this is also very Tarantino-y. What happens here? Two guys in a warehouse having like a standoff with guns. Yeah, it's it's all over the place at this time. Is the way that Quentin Tarantino has made people go violence and dialogue and glibness, and that's how we can make stuff seem zippy and cool and fun, right? Uh, it's a bit of an interlude, this page. It doesn't really relate to where we are. It does relate to where we're going. But this is Harper. What, Flint? Is that you, Governor? Bloody hell, it's a turn up for the books. Uh, we have met Flint, the guy on the other end of the phone, before. Uh, he was in the strip club in, let me remember, one of the Lord Fanny issues? Yeah, like the third one, perhaps. Uh, Remember, there was like a guy kind of in like a seedy Soho strip joint kind of thing, and a couple of blokes went up to him and said, "We're reactivating Division X." Uh, you what? You've reactivated Division X? So this guy who's just been, so they're having a standoff. A phone rings. It distracts this guy. Somebody does in fact say, "I've got you banged to rights, you bastard," which is, that's dialogue. Those are words. Uh, the phone goes off. He's distracted. This guy here in the weird 70s clothes takes advantage, bang, shoots the guy, but he's not quite dead, even though he's been shot in the head. And he's like, he takes the call. Bloody hell, right, Governor. They've reopened Division X. He turns around and kills this guy to shut him up. And that's the end of the page. This will all, obviously Division X is a thing. Remember the phone in the room as well. Uh, so we're getting there. This is just kind of advancing that subplot on a bit. But also not explaining itself, not like just appearing in the flow of this comic, and that's a Tarantino thing too. That the scene just changes abruptly, doesn't explain itself, and then gives you that. Okay, then we've got a couple of panels here, and we're still in the torture room, and somebody's whispering, "Is it working yet? Has it begun to work?" This is presumably the thing they just injected him with. We get another flashback for King Mob. They're still in Cairo. He's still talking to El Fayed, and they appear to be in, like the Mummy Museum. Yeah, brilliant picture of a mummy. It's weird because this, we are told, is in Cairo. I've no doubt there's lots of, obviously, there's loads of like Egyptian-y stuff in Cairo in the museums and that there. But this room looks exactly like the British Museum's Egyptian room. All of the mummies and stuff, like all the stuff we nicked from there. Uh, Kind of the thing that we might not be thinking about, but kind of should be thinking about, would be that uh, this room would be where Aleister Crowley and his missus stroke wife at the time, I think, would that be Rose Kelly, would that be right? I don't care too much about this stuff, so I'm not really up on it, but like, this is where this room is probably the room where she would have seen the Stele of Revealing, which kind of kickstart, this is what, 1904? So 90 years before King Mob and El Fayed are in there. Aleister Crowley and Rose would have been in there seeing the artifact that triggered the reception of the Crowleyite Book of the Law, basically. Yeah. Uh, Also, this uh, pyramid here, yeah, the big one in the middle, like Crowley and Crowley and Kelly snuck in there. I think I'm right in saying it was Rose. I could be wrong. Snuck in there and fucked and did a ritual. Possibly the first people in like thousands of years to do so, and that was the initiatory thing that kickstarted the process that also took them here. Rose saw this thing, the Stele of Revealing, whatever it is, said, "That's me, that's you." Crowley was like, oh my God. And within a couple of days, they had gone back to their hotel room and he had written the received text from the angel Iwas. Yeah? This is one of these invisible subcurrents that's going on that the text is not being explicit about, but like if you read between the panels a bit, that is kind of what we're being told here, right? And we've got El Fayed talking about accelerationism more, right? There. And he's pointing at this beautifully rendered by Phil Jimenez mummy. There. Forget what you know and look at it, my friend. What does it remind you of? King Mob goes, because he's well funny. The Invisible Man, because of the bandages, yeah. The This is El Fayed again. The ancient Egyptians developed a highly sophisticated technology of mortality and beyond. The mummified body is not what we think. It is a symbol. Look, it's simple. The mummy is a cocoon. See, that's why we are devouring our environment. Man, like the caterpillar or the maggot, is a creature in its larval stage. We consume to fuel our imminent metamorphosis. This is accelerationism, right? This is that, like, the thought that the system needs to just keep going until it kind of breaks its own logic and produces something unexpected but better. This isn't the place to talk about that. You know about that already because it's one of the main thoughts that people have now, right? It was a few years back. The cathedral, the basilisk, Nickland, the singularity. It's weird actually how. So like, if there was like a link to Warwick in this, that would be awesome, right? But basically, while these, and this is quite interesting. This is not like maybe this pops up earlier in the 60s or the 70s psychedelic culture, right? But and indeed, it does a bit, but it hadn't really got. It was still very underground thinking at this point, and it was being theorized in the kind of the more outre parts of the academy, for instance, Warwick University, a particular part of a particular department there. But Sadie Plant, Mark Fisher, Nick Land, they were having differently put, better put, really. Some of Nick Land's early writing is quite interesting, and he is just talking about like Predator and Terminator. It's really fun. Are talking about this kind of process, right? And they're throwing in a bunch of, occult Crowleyite mumbo jumbo too, right? Uh, but it's also in this comic, right? And Mark Fisher's work would be at least another 5 years before that became common currency, 6 or 7 really. And then more like, what Fisher's first book actually came out in like 2008, right? 2007 maybe. So like a good 12 years away. And yet Morrison's there. It's smart shit, right? He's intuiting or receiving. I think receiving is maybe what a good way of putting it, given what we know about what he says about his Kathmandu abduction experience and the way that he's obviously calling out another received text here, right? Whether it's from an angel or from an alien or some other kind of proto-human intelligence. Morrison's receiving very like up-to-date information, right? So like Morrison has received and is able to express thoughts that some really smart people on a lot of speed in Warwick are kind of workshopping together. They're really like, there's like 3 or 4, 5, 6 people in a university department, which looks a bit like an art studio, hot housing these kind of ideas while listening to Jungle and doing lots of speed and ecstasy. And they're coming up with this idea, but they're not expressing it as concisely as Morrison is. And it's taking a lot of them to kind of get there, and they're having to do a lot of background reading of Deleuze and Lyotard and stuff and Debord, in fact, to kind of get there. And and Morrison's keeping pace with them in that kind of intellectual hothouse scenario. And that's kind of weird for a guy who's just writing a fucking comic, right? This is just fucking Superman bullshit. But actually, damn. Yeah, I mean, more on that anon, probably. But I think that's the interesting point here, right? Is that the CCRU have basically had their entire output summed up within one and uh, uh, one and a bit. So like 1 and a bit pages of this like trashy comic book is kind of right up there with like the cutting edge of academic philosophy at the time as well. That's quite weird. That's not normal for a comic book that's being published by Warner Brothers or whatever. That shouldn't be so. Splash! It's not a splash page. It's just a page where he's getting splashed. Obviously, King Mob is kind of passed out at this point. He's been retreating into this memory. So they wake him up with a bucket of water to the face. Frankland and Samiles are restarting their interrogation. Samiles notes, Franklin goes, "Oh, you're covered in blood, by the way. Have I said this about how Frankland is Orlando? Yeah, Frankland? Like the way that the Frankish state was constructed. Yeah, we know that, right?" He says, "There's blood on your chin, Samiles. Is everything all right?" And he goes, "Oh, where's my handkerchief to wipe my chin?" Oh, he hasn't got it. Plot point. And Miles is back on at King Mob. "I don't care how strong you think you are. In an hour or two, you'll be begging to betray everyone you've ever known. In an hour or two, you'll be trading your bloody soul for just a moment without pain." You've got to love Sir Miles's like bad guy dialogue and King Mob's face all like, "Ah, shit, this is fucked up." Good, intense drama stuff, yeah? Good stuff. So Kid Sir Miles is going back into his mind because obviously putting your hands on the side of somebody's head, that's very good for telepathy. Everyone knows that. And he throws but he's getting another Gideon Stargrave story. This time it's 80s. Yeah, we've got all of these very 80s signifiers here. We've got Ronald Reagan. We've got the we've got what is basically like an early stealth bomber schematic. We've got the Ballad of John and Yoko ends with his murder. That's like a headline from when John Lennon died in 1980. We've got Duran Duran album cover. That's like what? That must be 1982 or three decade. Maggie Thatcher, boo. Like a car, a Peugeot or something. And a shot of the moon from space. Now all of this kind of like newspapery cut up stuff. This is all more Jerry Cornelius stuff. This is kind of how Moorcock wrote those novels, was by taking a lot of speed and going through the newspapers and just kind of like sticking Jerry Cornelius in these news stories that he was reading. Another big thing that happened within this 80s milieu was the wedding of Prince Charles and Lady Di, right? And this is a very glamorous 60s woman who's with Gideon in this bit. It turns out that that's Genevieve Stargrave, and they have an incestuous kind of like cross-dimensional relationship. And he says, it must be kept in mind that incest has long been regarded as the sacred prerogative of royalties and divinities, gods and royals. Think about the lad who lives behind the creepy lad with the face who lives behind the mirror. What's he called? You know, the creepy guy who lives behind who was in the Royal Monsters episode, right? Genevieve Stargrave here, looking nice, says, I'm sure I saw Prince Charles on telly marrying something like a jellyfish, but now he's got some blonde with red cheeks and puppy fat. There are more realities these days than there are television channels. Okay, so they're like Genevieve and Gideon Stargrave are kind of like flipping through different universes and stuff. And she thinks that Prince Charles is married to a jellyfish. Again, think about our royal monster guy. But now it's Princess Di, right? So she's kind of like looks like what Princess Di was meant to look like. She's talking about seeing Princess Di on the telly. Princess Di's new father-in-law, nearly, is explaining accelerationism to King Mob. This comic is really fucked up and weird that it can be doing this stuff. I mean, I'm sorry. I mean, I hope you don't think I'm like over egging it, but like the way that these things pile up is unusual. What's really, really fucking depressing is that like uh it's 25 years later and Britain is still, and maybe this is kind of about that, and maybe this is responsible for that. Britain's still just this ridiculous royal soap opera shit show. Yeah, isn't it brilliant? Thatcher wants to have Charles burned in a wicker man this summer. She reckons it'll bring down inflation. And did you see that old goat Reagan describing me as a false Christ in his emergency broadcast last night? I'm really peeved. Uh, that's how they roll. That's how they're living. Uh, his outfit is kind of maybe just worth noting. He's got like a kind of a red guard jacket on, these like lace up knee white plastic knee boots, and like very tight trousers, should we say? Leggings, really, meggings. They're meggings. Oh, we'll always have incest. And look, he's kind of strategically placed. You know, we can't. There's King Mob stroke Gideon Stargrave is standing there in this alternate reality that's kind of imaginary, but you know, aren't they all? And he's standing in front of this woman's face, and that's Princess Di too, right? Before we get too far away from Princess Di, so he's not sure where they are, except they're in some sort of 80s pop video place, and he's dressed as a 60s mod, but like a reconstructed one. And she's dressed as like a 60s op art chick, but again, a reconstructed one. We're over the page. I'm not stitching too much. I'm aware that I'm not stitching too much together in these little Gideon Stargrave interludes, but they're meant to sit as little conceptual, visual vignettes, right? They just they begin and end themselves, and then when you come back to them, they're somewhere else. The continuity between them doesn't really fit. They actually work in relation to one another a lot like panels in a comic book do. Like, they don't have, like, the reader, as much as or more than the author, is doing all of the work between the panel to create a continuity and a meaning between these otherwise a-causal moments, yeah, or non-connected moments. Okay, so over the page, but he's still in the same uniform, and he's talking to Flash Harry, or a guy called Harry, sorry, who's selling him a stealth bomber. £1 million for that ape. Come on, Harry. The steering's knackered and the stereo doesn't work. Oh, this is funny. This is good stuff. Now, steady on, Mr. S. I'm cutting my own throat here. Ever since the collapse of capitalism, this American surplus gear has been fetching very nice prices. So we could maybe think that this is, although there's something terribly 80s about this scene that we've just been in, this feels like the 90s. We're as close to the present day within the Gideon Stargrave imaginary sequences as we would have been because of this stealth bomber. Although stealth bombers were public things by the 90s, they would have been real in the 80s, wouldn't they? They would have had them then. They just didn't tell us then. So there's a lot here about, like, where time and reality sit and how they're formed out of just availability of knowledge and availability of consensus. Like, reality, yeah. 800 grand is yours. I've got a dodgy bloke in Iraq who's got his beady eye on this lot. God above time doesn't change. 700, they're haggling over the price of buying a stealth bomber with missiles, with warheads. And it's a great, like, pastiche of a conversation that you'd have in an episode of Minder. Or maybe the Avengers or something, if we're going to be 60s about it, because he is very 60s and Avengers-y looking. So's he. This character we get this weird close-up on Harry's face. There's in the Joe Cornelius books, he's got like a mate called Mo Collier, who I think has a kind of a shifty sort of spear vibe like this. Could be wrong. Or I might be misreading what Mo Collier is like, but I think he's got this kind of shifty spear vibe. Selling nylons and stuff, and what else was it? Nylons. That's what Spear sold, wasn't it? Stuff that you couldn't get unless you had a line on America, basically. Now, instead of selling nylons instead of selling stockings to British housewives, he's selling stealth bombers to Beatles wannabes. Crazy mixed up time. The dissonances here and the discordances are really nicely played with, and although I'm a bit of a sucker for this kind of shit, it does. Ooh, it kind of gets you, right? It's like, ooh, this is a fun play of signifiers, It makes me a dick. I appreciate that, but I like it. Like, I'm enjoying this. Where are you headed then? Somewhere north, eh? Washington first, I reckon. I'm cultural imperialism coming home to roost. Yeah. So so this could be like a 90s or an early 90s or even a late 80s where the Soviets won, right? Because he talked about the collapse of capitalism rather than what has really just happened within the last 5 years of history, which would be the collapse of communism, right? Then I fancy nuking New York. I want it to look like it does at the end of Planet of the Apes. Airborne. And there's a cool shot of him flying a stealth bomber, and he's flying into Washington, which is already kind of like burning. There's riots and shit going on. It feels really like a Moorcock novel by this stage. And he's going to blow up. He's going to nuke Washington, which is cool. Washington looks, I mean, I don't know if Washington really looks like this. It looks like a very sort of, I might even look it up. It looks like a very Roman Washington. And obviously that kind of, imperialist architecture is a big feature in Washington. Everyone knows that. And all these Masonic layouts and stuff and obelisks and all that. But I don't know if this is like real Washington or like style Washington, Either way, it doesn't matter. What does matter, God, there's a lot going on in this comic. Sorry for taking me so long. Nearly near the end, actually. I've made bad time. But this is the kind of thing that's important. So we've got this cool shot of a stealth bomber. We don't know if we're in the 80s of real reality or the 90s of consensus reality when a stealth bomber was a thing that existed. And we get this caption: the music on Stargrave's earplug-sized tape player. So he's wearing an AirPod, basically. The Beatles, The Move, The Shop Assistants, The Mixers, The Jesus and Mary Chain, The Times, The Television Personalities, The Pastels, The Sex Pistols, The Five, Buzzcocks, The Birds. So it's like a kind of a cool shopping list of bands that you should be listening to if you're, anarcho psychedelic Britpop guy like Gideon Stargrave, right? Now, hang on. So there's a lot of bands on that list. The Five and The Mixers, those are both like bands that Grant Morrison was in. The Shop Assistants and The Pastels. I don't think I got around to looking up The Pastels because I got stuck on some of the other ones. But basically, the Shop Assistants and The Pastels are like Scottish indie bands before they got twee, right? Kind of noisy and fuzzy and good. Remember like Dane's heart punk thing that I was kind of struggling to talk about at the end of the previous issue? That, if you want a sound for that in your head, the Shop Assistants is a really good place to start. Jesus and Mary Chain, you should know who they are. The Birds, you should know who they are. The Sex Pistols, you should know who they are. Relevant. Buzzcocks, the Beatles, the Move. The Move are good. I didn't really know much about the Move before I started listening to them for this issue. But solid. They've got a track called like Brontosaurus, which is really good. It's really good, look like chunky, just about pre-glam, pop rock. Yeah. Yeah, the Move were weirdly good. Like it was like Roy Wood, right? Was the songwriter behind them who did I Wish It Could Be Christmas Every Day. And there's an obvious just kind of like sort of effortless making good tunes thing that he's got. The Times, yeah, I don't know about the Pastels. I think the Pastels are another just like Scottish indie band. That's where if I had to say, well, I sort of do. I'm supposed to be doing a podcast here. The Pastels are like another indie band from Scotland in the 80s. But the ones that really caught my ears are the Times and the Television Personalities. Those are both Scottish indie bands, featuring Ed Ball, who's a bit like King Mob and Grant Morrison in that they were bald guys in the 90s. Yeah? The Times and the Television Personalities, what's a good way to describe them? They're like the Invisibles is a good way to describe them, insofar as perhaps a better way to say it is they're like King Mob, insofar as they aren't really like there's something really kind of surfacely cool and good about them, but there's nothing in them which isn't sort of pop culture bric-a-brac. They had this weird so they were big from like no, they were never big, but they were like a thing from like maybe 81 to 85 kind of thing. And they were 80s, 60s revivalists. This is coming out in 1996, remember? So we're another dozen years on from then. And the 60s revival thing, which is all Britpop basically was, is really big at this time. And the Times and the television personalities with these two Ed Balls bands. Ed Balls was still around. Ed Balls? Do I mean Ed Balls? No, I mean Ed Ball, not not the ex Shadow Chancellor who tweeted his own name rather than searching for his own name, amusingly, memorably once. Anyway, Ed Ball was in these two bands, and he was like a 60s revivalist, 12 to 15 years too early. So his bands never got big, but they did put out these very bric-a-brac collage 60s power pop records, which sound kind of amazing, kind of brilliant, but also weirdly surfacey. Weirdly, there's nothing else going on here except for this kind of like pop culture parody thing. Parody's a bit too harsh, or pastiche. They were pasticheur, and as you probably already feel, that there's something not quite good enough about that, right? You can't, in kind of the way that Gideon Stargrave relate Jerry Cornelius, you can't just do a pastiche of something better than you and it be good, even if it's a very good pastiche. People smell it, right? People see it coming, and they know that that's not as good as the real thing, right? And although there are kind of spurious arguments around authenticity and recombination, which need to be taken into account, it's not enough just to be in 1981 and to be doing like 60s beat pop pastiche, like psychedelic beat pop, Carnaby Street, Summer of Love pastiches, and be taken seriously. It's not enough to just be like a retro band, right? Which is kind of what they were. And I encourage you to listen to their records because they're very interesting. Hit moments of like melodic, like, wow, that's greatness. And yet 30 seconds later, you're kind of like, oh no, this is just a rip-off of something else. This doesn't feel right. Even though they're brilliantly constructed records, there's traces of like Prince in them. When there's traces of the Beatles, like really badly, traces of like late Small Faces and the Kinks and stuff like they're like Stone, like all of the whizzy power pop of the 60s. They do it, and they do it kind of perfectly, but that's not enough. I'm really struggling to describe what I mean here, but I encourage you to listen to the Times and the television personalities. Ed Ball had one of the best songs of the Britpop era called the Mill Hill Self Hate Club. Quite difficult to find on Spotify, easy to find on YouTube though, with the video, which is like the most 90s thing in the world. I encourage you to check it out because I think it's one of the best songs of the period. And almost the point that like all of Ed Ball's work in these bands in the 80s too early to make money out of it. Basically, he did get a kind of a second bite of the cherry at it in uh, the 90s using surplus Oasis money that Creation Records had. And you can see Alan McGee, the guy from Creation Records, is in the video and stuff. Ed Ball was like the organ player with the Boo Radleys, another Creation Records band at the time. Obviously like a decent guy, I presume. Very inventive, great ear for melody and stuff. Like definitely knew his pop, but if anything, knew his pop sort of too well. Had sort of had his own self kind of devoured by it. The Times and television personalities tracks, which don't sound like weird sort of Sergeant Pepper pastiches, just sound like Jam rip-offs, you know. And there's something kind of brilliant about it, and all of the signifiers are in place, and it doesn't quite work. It's really and it's exactly the right kind of music for someone as sort of as glib and superficial as Gideon Stargrave and King Mob, who we're learning a lot about here, should be. The other parts of it is just Grant Morrison talking about himself and his bands in the 80s, and then weird like classics like the Sex Pistols, the Buzzcocks, the Byrds. So like the Sex Pistols and the Buzzcocks and the Byrds and the Beatles and the Move arguably all kind of have a similar relationship to each other. The ones that really stand out here for me are the Jesus and Mary Chain, who were kind of like an indie goth rock band, emphasis on the indie. You know the Jesus Mary Chain, they're huge. You should know them. But they were quite like a hard rocking band in a way that the rest of these weren't. They had a much kind of grittier feel to them, much kind of tougher, if you like. Even though, you know, actually, I wouldn't pick a fight with the Jesus and Mary Chain guys. They beat me up, probably even to this day, I think. But yeah, and Scottish. It's a really weird playlist. It's quite a good playlist. There's a lot of fun to be had there, and a lot of thoughts to be provoked there. But it's a weird playlist. Da, 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 da. Radar invisible, skimming like a stone. Remember Kenneth Arnold's descriptions of the, flying saucers aren't. The original description of the flying saucers weren't shaped like saucers. Kenneth Arnold described their movement as being like saucers skipped across the surface of a lake. So they're not shaped like saucers. They just move like them. He described their shape as being like deltas, like this. I'm pretty sure that stealth bombers just fly like airplanes. But that description there of skimming like a stone, bouncing on water, that's how Kenneth Arnold described the first ever like documented UFOs. Yeah, 1947. Were those UFOs that he saw experimental aircraft? Yeah, maybe aliens. There's a lot going on this page, and nothing's happening. It's so good. Over the page. So we're still probing King Mob's mind. Sir Miles and King Mob goes, "What do you want?" And then Sir Miles says, "Information. You won't get it." And all of a sudden, we're doing this 60s pop pastiche thing, but we're doing it with a TV show, The Prisoner. And this is a white barbalith here, right? Yeah, this is the green stroke red circle that we keep seeing everywhere. It's very clearly just meant to be this here now. And it's also Dane's blank badge, right? But it's the rover from The Prisoner. And suddenly King Mob isn't a Beatles wannabe. He's a Patrick McGowan wannabe from The Prisoner. And Sir Miles is number 2 from The Prisoner. We're in a scenario from The Prisoner here, which is also their base from the Invisibles base in Soho from issue 1. And we're also at the time machine. We're also at the time machine from the Arcadia storyline, being shown. It's a time machine, Gideon. Isn't it wonderful? Yes, but what exactly do you mean by time, Dr. Comin? Like, you'd be allowed to say this is bad writing because it just collapses everything so quickly into just like this rush of imagery and illusion and maybes and what ifs and have you thought of this? But I do not think, therefore I am. It's so I do not think, therefore I am is the lesson that Tom teaches Dane when he forces him to look into the blank badge. Yeah, it could be bad writing the way that all of this just kind of flies in, but there's something about the sort of the devil may careness with which it's done, with which it kind of flirts with its own possibly being bad writing and definitely being bric-a-brac, definitely just being pastiche, because like it couldn't be more clear about how pastiche it's being, with its beaten up, fungal faced Grant Morrison stroke Ed Ball, Barbalith Rover, Sir Miles number 2, School, Time Machine, and Dr. Cohen. Yes, but what exactly do you mean by time, Dr. Cohen? Dr. Cohen, who is, I guess, the guy who invented the time machine that they used in the Arcadia storyline, also looks rather a lot like Flash Harry, who flogs stealth bombers, time machines, UFOs. What if the UFO is just a woman? And this is all like, okay, so trying to make like a linear sense of this, it's you shouldn't be doing it. It's not a sensible thing to try to do. You're just supposed to kind of process these moments non-linearly and allow like the vibe, like the echo, to get the meaning into you. What was I going to say? It's like the Jerry Cornelius novels. Like, fair enough for Michael Moorcock to be pissed off if he wants to be about Morrison nicking his ideas, but also, like, Moorcock was innovating a non-linear stream of consciousness style of like pulp fiction, trash fiction, sci-fi, spy-fi fiction, and it is kind of fair enough for somebody else to go, that's just a style. I can do that because it's a good way of getting information across. It's a way of getting information across which is fit for a hypermediated society. Um, Certainly in the 90s when we had that level of hypermediation, take it forward 25 years to the kind of like bizarre shit show that we've got now, and this kind of feels a bit quaint, to be honest, in the way that it sort of presents its senselessness to you. Because the senselessness that we have to kind of pass now is even more bitty and blippy than this, and the kind of the apprehensions of sense that we've got to put behind it or on top of it as a grid. They're even less stable. Sucks to be us, guys. Sucks to be us, guys. I'm not really talking about the prisoner. I kind of can't be asked to. King Mob is the right age to have watched The Prisoner when he was a kid, or when he was a kid, and it obviously left an impression on him. And he's like a prisoner guy. I've only really watched The Prisoner once. I watched it very, very stoned in like a week when I was, that age. And it is as brilliant as everyone says. Like you should, it must be hard. It must be easy to find The Prisoner now. If they're still if it's not just all on YouTube or whatever, that's a disgrace. It should just be, you should just be able to get it by googling it. Imagine somebody like Patrick McGowan's long dead. Imagine still like, no, I'm going to try and make money out of The Prisoner. It's like, just for fuck's sake, the labour of everybody involved there has been done. It should be free now. Watch it. The rebels are all very clever when it comes to criticism. I love Sir Miles as Leo McKern. That's just great. The rebels are all very clever when it comes to criticising the social order, but they're not so quick to suggest any alternatives. Do you have any useful ideas about how we might improve this society you seem to hate so much? And then suddenly, we're into proper phantasmagoria now, because we're not even in a Gideon Stargrave thing. We're not really in King Mob's world. We're just in an issue of, in a scene from If, which we've spoken about before. Stroke The Prisoner. Stroke a young Gideon Stargrave. Just a young King Mob. You, the Polish boy, Staracewski, Stargrave. I'd burn all the churches, sir. Tear down the government buildings. Blow it up. Blow it all up. And then he's got a vibro gun and he blasts Headmaster Sir Miles in this kind of like psychic headspace where they're clashing with a vibro gun, which is the thing that we see him have on the cover, which I've lost. He shoots Sir Miles and blows Sir Miles to pieces. And this is kind of good because, like, again, all of like the kind of the sensorium rush of sense thing happens. It starts to break down really badly here, and it's great. Like, King Mob just killed Sir Miles after all of the. So basically, what's been happening here the whole time is that Sir Miles has been just doing psychic interrogation. King Mob has been kind of throwing all of these shields and weird dream scenarios at him to distract him, and it ends with King Mob as a boy putting a bullet through Sir Miles. He totally just wins this issue, and Sir Miles is like, he sort of breaks the psychic link, and Like, you can see the smirk on King Mob's face. He knows he's just won that little round. But and Samar's like, oh, stop it. Oh, God, you haven't really won. I'm not really dead. Can you feel your head spitting? You'll tell us everything in the end. He's doing his proper Samiles evil guy rant dialogue. It's very good. And he's really pissed off that he did just lose that little head-to-head that they had. Uh, if anything, it's convinced him more that it is King Mob, because there's no way that he couldn't be King Mob if he was able to play this psychic interrogation game better than he is. See, this is always the thing, right? Is that like one of like the kind of the story thing, the mechanic that always happens in the and the mechanism that always happens in the prisoner is that it looks like the prisoner's losing until he goes at the end, oh, I just won, and number two goes, oh no, he won. And that's just like every episode, that's what happens and then this happens, and it's like, well, you didn't win that much, you're still in the village, and the village here being a torture room. With the rover spotlight. I'll tell you, this is the worst place in the world. This is room 101. So we're still in an Orwell novel. We're still in 1984, the room where the thing you fear the most is kept. And King was kind of freaking out now. And Samar says, the drug appears to be taking effect. How long can we keep him alive? As long as it takes, I suppose. And longer, if possible. And King Mob's like, what? You can hear that, and he's like, he ain't pleased. He raises an eyebrow, sort of, with his kind of slightly smashed up face. Very well, recline the chair. And they basically get the scalpels out. They turn his chair into a hospital bed, and they're about to up this interrogation a notch. And the last thing you see is them leering over the Barbalith blank badge rover thing is now just a spotlight, an interrogation spotlight, and the baddies are leaning over a helpless King Mob with scalpels. And it's really like, oh, okay, you kind of have won and you kind of haven't. And that's just the end of chapter 1 of this interrogation scene or interrogation story that we've got. And that's the end of the issue. It's very enjoyable. And then, okay, so over onto the letters page, onto the Invisible Ink page. This is the bit that I read out previously about what Gideon Stargrave is and how he relates to Jerry Cornelius and James Bond. The first letter is by somebody called Grey Malkin, which isn't a real name, but it is like Grey Malkin's like. Isn't Grey Malkin the name of the street that the X-Men live on or something? And it's also like the name of like one of the familiars from like a witch trial or something, isn't it? Should look this up. It's a nice letter. He kind of gives like a funny pastiche of Garth Ennis response, because he says that he forgot to give a shout out to Preacher when he was listing the comics that he read in the letters page 15, but it's not a terribly interesting letter. Then Spunkmeyer from the Philippines. We like Spunkmeyer. He's got a funny name, and he's a letter hack. Writes like a long letter, longish letter. He notices, he kind of calls out the stuff that was happening in the She-Man arc that I spoke about, where the style kept shifting abruptly into different registers, right? The most obvious one being the one where Jill Thompson suddenly starts drawing like Rob Liefeld. And we get and this is Morrison's response, and it's worth reading out because it fills in, it clarifies all of that. And the Spunkmeyer has asked in his letter, whose idea is it that you should just draw like Rob Liefeld for a page? And Morrison says, I'm afraid Jill was the victim of a sinister Svengali, Spunkmeyer, for it was I and I alone that insisted she draw King Mob in the style of Rob Liefeld. This second year's worth of stories revolve around the common theme of shamanic trial. Fanny with her gods, Dane with his aliens, King Mob at the mercy of his enemies, etc. And I decided that it was my duty to force my artists into a similar confrontation with the deepest, darkest portions of their psyches. In Jill's case, I chose a tantric exercise similar in principle to the infamous Vama Marg ritual, in which the aspiring adept must have sex with a diseased hag in order to rid himself of all disgust and attachment to the body. In Jill's case, becoming Rob Liefeld, thinking like Rob Liefeld, assuming the physical characteristics of Rob Liefeld in order to perfectly recreate his action-packed poses was the most extreme form of behavior modification I could conceive. This is funny. Okay, this is just funny. This is a good joke. It's not an unserious joke, and I think Morrison kind of means it, and that's why it's funny. And it's Rob Liefeld, and that's why it's funny. Following her successful completion of the ordeal, Jill has now left the Wheel of Karma. Actually, I'd asked her to do it because I'd just seen and been deeply impressed by Natural Born Killers, which was the advert on the back page of the first issue of The Invisibles, which I didn't get around to talking about for some reason, even though it's basically just like Woody Harrelson as King Mob on it. That's the great that's the great absence in the Invisible podcast, is why I didn't talk about that advert. Actually, I asked her to do it because I'd just seen and been deeply impressed by Natural Born Killers. I wanted to apply some of Oliver Stone's postmodern techniques to The Invisibles, and where he used black and white and Super 8 film and borrowed visual styles from MTV and porno and surveillance camera video footage, etc., I decided to borrow distinctive styles from past comic books. So if you look closely at Invisibles number 13, you'll see the style of Rob Liefeld for King Mob's action scene, the narrative techniques of Watchmen used for the King Mob stroke Lady Edith scenes, Sin City black and white that when Brody's beating up Kirby, Los Bros Hernandez stylings for the Latin American scenes, Ripley's Believe It or Not for the description of Teotihuacan, and so on throughout that and the following 2 issues. Which is a nice, concise and well-written way of saying all of the shit that I've been trying to say for hours during these. Then there's an anonymous letter complaining that he prefers Doom Patrol to the Invisibles. Yeah, and then a response where he goes, "Yeah, but I'm writing a different comic now. Don't care what you think." And then a letter from a guy called Jason E. Aaron, which I think is Jason Aaron, the comic book writer. He writes Marvel comics and wrote a kind of a tough, bold guy comic set on like the Res called Scalped, which I read a bit of. Was alright. A bit too like it was like Breaking Bad, but on like a Native American reservation, right? With a cop. Yeah, I read a bit of it. It was alright. I think this is him. I enjoy reading The Invisibles. I enjoy reading all your shit. I gladly give you my money. You must be Jesus reincarnated. If you open your own Shaolin temple like in Kung Fu, I want to be the grasshopper. Oh, this is nice because he was kind of inspired to become a comic book writer by reading The Invisibles, and it really worked for him. Yeah, he's written loads of like Thor, and yeah, he was really, a few years ago, maybe he still is, I don't really know, but he was well up in Marvel comics and stuff. Jason Aaron, well done, mate. Hey, I just read Like a Velvet Glove Cast in Iron. That's the funny Daniel Clowes one that everybody thinks is very serious. That was pretty good too. Now I'm reading Lipstick Traces by Grail Marcus. I think, we mentioned that in reference to the Arcadia arc and stuff, I think. I just walked into the bookstore looking for something subversive, and there it was with some Nazi books staring at me. That's a bit like something I mentioned an issue or 2 ago. Sympathy for the Devil, the Goddard film about the making of Sympathy for the Devil, like the bit in the comic book stroke Nazi book shop in there, right? That's really fucked up. Did I talk about that? I should talk about that more if I didn't. But yeah, like, watch Goddard's making of the Rolling Stones Sympathy for the Devil film. Listen to and watch if you can. But listen mainly to the soundtrack by George Harrison to Wonderwall, which is the song that is informing the weird 60s-ness that's occurring throughout this Britpop era that this comic is juicing so much from. Yeah, Goddard and the Wrongen who is reading from Mein Kampf in that scene. Am I making any sense at all? that's there's some nasty deep state shit happening in that network there. George Harrison's Wonderwall, the guy who's the producer of the Goddard movie, who's in the Goddard movie too, reading Mein Kampf in the Nazi comic book shop where the Maoists are getting slapped when people buy books. Right? I mean, oh, that's good. That's some good shit. Check that out. Message me if you want me to explain that more. But there's some good dark, deep state, nasty shit in all that. I shook Ray Bradbury's hand once. This is still Jason Aaron. I shook Ray Bradbury's hand once, and one day I want to shake yours. Your head must be so full of cool stuff. Da, 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 da. So do you like Annie DeFranco? Morrison says, no, I haven't. Uh, bit, a bit, a bit. Then finally, the last letter. Grant, Invisibles is the perfect comic. And then Hal, and then the response from Morrison is, Hal, this is the perfect letter. Grant. Next issue. Those are the letters. It's not a great letters page. Next issue, brutal torture of King Mob, mind control drugs to make the reader scared, milky virus, vicious greedy, full of fear. There is nothing like this. Pray it doesn't breed. Then, the On the Ledge is by Elaine Lee. It's about Hollywood in Vain, the Vamps comic. We talked about that last time. Oh, because it's talked about that in the last episode because it's. Oh no, not all right. It was a previous issue. We talked about that because it was one of the adverts in the previous issue. She's got this kind of story about like trying to get scripts sold in Hollywood. It's quite interesting. Feels very modern actually in these kind of Netflixy days. Comics you can get. Dun, dun, dun. Yeah, it's a good week, isn't it? It's a good month. It was good times back then. You've got early Mark Miller before he went to rubbish. You've got Peter Milligan. You've got Garth Ennis. Got Matt Wagner. Got Ted McKeever. Got a lot of good shit coming up. Like they're hitting the end of the Sandman, which is good too. Obviously, let's not bother talking about that. Nearly going for 2 hours again. Fucking hell. On the back page, it looks like it's an advert for like Paradise Lost, right? Some sort of goth prog American band. But it's not. It's actually an advert for Mortal Kombat. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. In this case, rip out their spine and internal organs. It is the most intense fighting tournament in the universe. It is now available on the PC. It is an exact replica of the infamous arcade hit. It has special PC encryption codes, code with a K, that unlock debilitating powers. It has digitized sound and music identical to the coin-ops. It has network play capabilities, which means you can go head-to-head or foot-to-face with your ill-fated friends. It is not going to be pretty. Wow, so it was connected up even back then. Mortal Kombat 3 for the PC. Wow. Look at it. I mean, the design is quite good. I sound like such an old man. The arcade coin-op of Mortal Kombat. There wasn't many like arcade machines where I grew up. Trust me. When they came to town once a year, it was a big event. That's not even. I'm not even lying. I would see arcade machines. I would. Sometimes you'd go somewhere else and you'd see them there if you went to watch it, or some town on the coast where they still had arcades. I like the Mortal Kombat machine would come to my town once a year for about 3 days. and the tough lads would be crowded around it and you wouldn't get a look in. But the Mortal Kombat machines had scary vibes coming off them. There was something about the whackness of the digital blood and the kind of like sticky but photorealist, because it was based on photos, animation and the way that the people would be punching each other and there'd be blood, with like a kind of a baying crowd around them, and the baying crowd had this real sort of flatness to them, which is really creepy. Yeah, the Mortal Kombat machines were really creepy, and it's still a huge thing now, right? There's people still play Mortal Kombat, it's still a thing, which is weird. Like video games don't stop; they don't go away; they just get rebuilt, right? That's it. Sorry, I've gone on way too long to cover this issue. I'm going to do the next one without such a big gap as there was between this one and the last one. Okay, I'm going to try and catch up with myself. And these issues are really enjoyable. They're just difficult to talk about. So that's it. Yeah, follow me on @bobsy on Twitter. Keep checking out patreon.com/Diane podcast. It's not my turn to do a Diane podcast. The guys don't want to do it, and like they don't want to do it on Zoom. They think it's worth doing in the room. I agree with them. So I'm not sure when the next one's going to be. When everybody's chill about sitting in a small room together. Probably not too long. Or maybe second wave, virus calamity, maybe never. Check me out on Deep Status, because when I'm not podcasting or videoing here, I'll be doing it there. And that's deep_status on Twitter or patreon.com/Deep Status. Me and Sean are going to do another one of those quite soon. Because weird shit doesn't stop happening, so you've got to talk about it. Right, that's it. Bye. Thanks for watching.